The wind in Bitter Creek did not blow so much as it scoured. It was a relentless, invisible grit that chewed at the corner of the eyes and settled deep in the lungs. It had been blowing for 3 months straight, ever since the rains failed in early April. Now, in the dead heat of July in the year 1874, the town looked less like a settlement and more like a collection of bleaching bones scattered across the Arizona territory. Clara Vance stood at the doorway of the one-room schoolhouse, a small structure of rough-hewn pine that seemed to groan under the assault of the afternoon sun. She watched the horizon. There was no cloud to promise relief, only a vast, bruised expanse of violet and white heat. The drought had turned the prairie grass to brittle straw that crunched underfoot, and the creek that gave the town its name was nothing more than a series of muddy, stagnant pools where flies gathered in thick, buzzing clouds. Inside the schoolhouse, 6 children sat on split log benches, their heads bowed over slate tablets. The heat inside was suffocating, smelling of chalk dust, unwashed wool, and old wood. "That is enough for today," Clara said softly. Her voice sounded thin to her own ears, swallowed by the dry air. "You may go. Please walk straight home. Do not linger near the dry bed." The children did not scramble or shout as children usually did. They stood up slowly, their movements lethargic. Hunger and heat had sapped the play out of them. Little Timothy Miller, whose boots were 2 sizes too big and stuffed with rags, paused at the door. "Miss Clara," he said, looking up with eyes too big for his dusty face. "Pa says the cattle are dying because the Indians sang a curse on the water." "Is that true?" Clara felt a familiar tightness in her chest. It was the same anxiety that gripped the whole town, a poisonous mixture of ignorance and desperation. "No, Timothy," she said firmly, smoothing the hair back from his forehead. "The cattle are dying because there is no rain. It is nature, not a curse. Now run along." She watched him trudge away into the blinding light. When he was gone, she closed the heavy door and latched it against the wind. She leaned her forehead against the wood for a moment, closing her eyes. Her hand went instinctively to her chest, finding the leather cord hidden beneath the high collar of her calico dress. Her fingers traced the cold, plain circle of gold hanging there. It was the only thing William had left her, other than a pile of debts and a plot of hard earth in the churchyard. 2 years. It had been 2 years since the fever took him, leaving her a widow at 24 in a town that had barely existed 5 years prior. She remembered the day they had arrived, full of foolish hope, believing the West was a garden waiting to be tilled. She remembered William's laugh, breathless and bright, before the coughing started, and before that, she remembered the dark, cramped parlor back east in Ohio, and the smell of whiskey on her father's breath as he told her she was too plain to marry well and too stubborn to be obedient. She had come west to breathe, but the air here was just as choking, only in a different way. Clara gathered her books, secured her bonnet, and stepped out into the glare. Her day was only half over. The school paid very little, mostly in promises and firewood, so she kept the books for Mr. Henderson at the general store to afford her own flour and coffee. The walk to the store was a gauntlet of misery. The main street of Bitter Creek was a rutted track of hard-baked clay. False-fronted buildings leaned tiredly against the wind. A few horses stood hip-shot at the hitching rails, their heads hanging low, ribs showing through dull coats. As she passed the livery, she heard voices raised in the shadows. "It is the Apaches. I tell you, a man was saying—" His voice was jagged with fear. "They are pushed out of the mountains by the lack of game. They will come down here and take what they want." "We should strike first," another voice muttered, "before they scalp us in our beds." Clara kept her head down, clutching her shawl tight despite the heat. The talk was always the same. Bandits in the pass, Indians in the hills. The army is too slow. The government is too far away. Fear was the only thing that grew freely in Bitter Creek. She entered Henderson's general store, the bell above the door chiming with a cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place. The interior was dim and smelled of cured leather, dried apples, and kerosene. Mr. Henderson was behind the counter, wiping a spot that was already clean. He looked up, his face gray and drawn. "Afternoon, Mrs. Vance," he said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Henderson." She went to the high desk in the back corner and opened the heavy ledger. The numbers were grim. Credit extended to the Millers. Credit extended to the O'Malleys. No payment received from the Smith. The ink on the page looked like a map of the town's slow death. As she dipped her pen, she heard the door open again. Two women, Mrs. Higgins and Mrs. Gable, entered, the dust swirling in around their skirts. They did not see Clara in the back. "Did you hear, Mrs.?" Higgins whispered, her voice trembling with a sort of terrified delight. "The scouts were seen riding in from the South Ridge." "Scouts, Mrs.?" Gable asked. "Army scouts, from the fort. They say a whole band of them is coming. Coming here to trade, to talk, Mrs." Higgins lowered her voice further. "They say the truce is holding for now. But for how long? I told my husband to load the shotgun. I will not have those savages looking at my daughters." Clara's pen hovered over the paper. A drop of black ink fell, staining the column for July. A truce. That meant they were coming into the town proper. The fear in the women's voices was palpable, thick as the heat, but beneath it, Clara heard the thrill of excitement. In a life so devoid of event, even the prospect of danger was a welcome guest. The door banged open suddenly, making both women jump. It was breathless young Timothy. "They are coming," he shouted, forgetting his manners. "The soldiers and the Indians. They are coming down the pass." The ledger snapped shut. Clara stood up. She told herself it was curiosity, or perhaps a need to protect the children if trouble started. But as she walked toward the front of the store, her heart hammered a rhythm against her ribs that had nothing to do with duty. It was the rhythm of the unknown arriving at her doorstep. By the time Clara stepped onto the boardwalk, half the town had gathered. The heat radiating off the street was visible in shimmering waves. Men stood on the dirt, holding rifles loosely in the crooks of their arms, trying to look imposing. The women clustered on the raised wooden walkways and balconies, clutching their shawls and aprons, their faces pale beneath their bonnets. Captain Harlow rode in first. He sat high on a bay gelding that looked better fed than any horse in town. His blue uniform was dusty but buttoned to the chin. His mustache waxed to stiff points. He looked straight ahead, ignoring the townsfolk, embodying the authority of the United States Army. Behind him rode 4 troopers, looking tired and wary, their hands near their carbines. And then the Apache came. There were perhaps 20 of them. They rode small, wiry ponies that stepped sure-footed among the ruts. The ponies had no saddles, just blankets and woven ropes. The riders wore buckskin and cloth, dust-colored and simple. They did not look at the crowd. They looked through the crowd, their dark eyes scanning the horizon, the rooftops, the gaps between buildings. A collective intake of breath rippled through the watchers on the boardwalk. Clara stood near a support post, half hidden by the shadow of the overhang. She watched them pass. She had seen drawings in newspapers, caricatures with jagged teeth and wild eyes. These men were not cartoons. They were lean, hardened by a life Clara could scarcely imagine. They looked like the land itself, sculpted by wind and sun. Then, the last rider appeared. He was riding a horse slightly larger than the others, a roan with a wild eye, but the animal looked small beneath him. He was massive, not merely tall, though he towered over the soldiers flanking him, but broad and solid as a canyon wall. His shoulders strained against a faded calico shirt, and his legs, encased in high moccasins, were long and powerful. His black hair hung loose to his shoulders, held back by a simple strip of red cloth. A scar, thick and white, ran from his left ear down the sharp line of his jaw, disappearing into the hollow of his throat. It did not disfigure him. Rather, it gave his face a history of violence survived. He did not look at the ground. He did not look at the horizon. He looked directly at the people of Bitter Creek. Beside Clara, Mrs. Higgins gripped the rail so hard her knuckles turned white. She let out a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. "Mercy," the woman whispered. "Look at the size of him." Mrs. Gable, standing just behind her, pressed a hand to her throat. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the giant warrior. "Are these even real men?" she murmured. The question hung in the hot, still air. Clara heard it. She saw the way the women leaned forward, their fear warring with something primal and crude. She looked at the men of the town, the shopkeepers with their stooped shoulders, the farmers broken by the plow, the drunks with their watery eyes. They looked like dried husks. And then she looked back at the Apache. He was undeniably real. He was vividly, terrifyingly alive. As he passed the general store, the giant turned his head. His eyes, dark as obsidian, swept over the women on the boardwalk. He saw their fear, their revulsion, and their hungry curiosity. His expression remained impassive, a mask of stone. But for a second, his gaze stopped. He looked straight at Clara. Clara felt the breath leave her lungs. It was not a threatening look. It was a look of assessment. In that split second, she felt stripped of her bonnet, her heavy skirts, her widow's respectable silence. She felt he saw the loneliness carved into her bones, just as she saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes. They were two strangers from warring worlds. Yet, in that glance, there was a flicker of recognition, a shared understanding of what it meant to endure in a place that wanted to kill you. He looked away, turning his attention back to the road, but the heat of his gaze remained on her skin, hotter than the July sun. The procession halted in the center of the town square, kicking up a cloud of yellow dust. Captain Harlow raised a gloved hand. "Citizens of Bitter Creek," Harlow shouted, his voice booming with practiced authority. "Under the orders of the Department of the Interior and with the guidance of the Army, we have granted a temporary truce to this band of Chiricahua for the purpose of trade and negotiation regarding water rights at the Limestone Spring." A murmur of angry dissent rose from the men. Water rights? Elias Broderick stepped off the porch of the saloon. He was a tall man, though he looked soft compared to the warrior who had just passed. He wore a suit of fine gray wool, oblivious to the heat, and a silver watch chain glinted on his vest. He owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, and effectively, he owned the town. That spring is on open range. "Captain," Broderick said, his voice smooth and carrying, "my cattle need that water. If you let these savages camp there, my herd dies. And if my herd dies, this town dies." Harlow looked annoyed. "The treaty lines are clear. Mr. Broderick, the spring is on the edge of the reservation boundary. We are here to ensure there is no trouble." Broderick smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. He looked at the Apache leader, the giant with the scar, with a gaze of cold calculation. He did not see a man. He saw an obstacle to be removed, a pestilence to be fumigated. "You are bringing wolves into the sheepfold, Captain," Broderick said. "Do not be surprised when blood gets spilled." The giant warrior sat motionless on his horse. He did not speak. He did not react to the insult. He simply sat, radiating a silent, heavy gravity that made Broderick's words sound petty and shrill. Clara realized with a jolt that the Apache understood. He understood the tone, if not the exact words. Harlow waved a dismissive hand at the Apache group. "They understand the terms. They will camp north of the ridge. They have brought hides and crafts to trade for flour and salt. Treat them fairly, and the army will ensure your safety." He turned his horse. "Sergeant, dismiss the men." The square broke into chaos. The tension was a physical weight. The Apache men dismounted, moving with fluid grace, keeping their weapons close. The townspeople hesitated. Greed warring with bigotry. Hides were valuable. Baskets were useful. Clara turned to go back inside the store, her hands trembling slightly. She wanted to be away from the noise, away from the disturbing sight of the giant warrior. "Mrs. Vance!" It was Captain Harlow's voice. Clara stopped and turned. The captain had dismounted and was striding toward her, dusting his gloves against his thigh. "Captain," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Mr. Henderson tells me you have a knack for languages," Harlow said briskly. "Says you speak a bit of German and French from your schooling back east." "A little. Yes, but I do not see how that helps here." Harlow sighed, taking off his hat to wipe his sweating forehead. My interpreter is down with dysentery at the fort. I need someone to help with the basics. Just counting, trade goods, simple terms. And I need someone to occupy their children. Their children? Clara repeated. Harlow gestured vaguely toward the group. They brought a few young ones. Part of the show of good faith, I suppose. I need them kept out of the way while we talk terms with the Bucks. You are the school teacher. You can manage them. The Army will pay you $2 a week for the duration of their stay. $2 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a new pair of boots, enough to pay her tab at the store for a month. But the thought of being that close. I do not speak Apache. Captain? Harlow waved his hand. They pick up English fast enough when they want something. Just point and name things. Keep them calm. Keep them away from the saloon. Can you do it? Or do I have to ask Mrs. Higgins? Clara glanced at Mrs. Higgins, who was watching the Apache with a look of pure hatred. If Mrs. Higgins took the job, she would likely strike a child within the hour. I will do it, Clara said quietly. Good. Report to the back room of the supply depot in 10 minutes. The leader, the big one, Nantan. He wants to see where the trade goods will be stored. Nantan. The name sounded like stone striking earth. 10 minutes later. Clara stood in the back room of the supply depot. It was a windowless space piled high with crates of hardtack and sacks of grain. A single lantern burned on a barrel, casting long, jumping shadows. The door opened, and Captain Harlow entered, followed by the warrior. In the small room, Nantan seemed to consume all the available air. He had to duck his head to pass through the door frame. Up close, the details of him were overwhelming. The smell of wood smoke, sage and old leather that clung to him, the texture of his skin, weathered like cured hide, the deep, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. This is Mrs. Vance, Harlow said loudly, as if volume would bridge the language gap. She will help with the count. Nantan stopped 3 feet from Clara. He did not look at Harlow. He looked at her. Clara forced herself to stand her ground. She clasped her hands in front of her apron to hide their shaking. She looked up and up until she met his eyes. He was terrifying. There was no other word for it. The sheer physical power he possessed could crush her in an instant. But as she held his gaze, she saw something else behind the obsidian darkness of his irises. She saw fatigue. She saw a man who was carrying the weight of a dying people on his broad shoulders. Nantan, Harlow said, pointing at Clara. Teacher, she helps. Nantan looked at Harlow, then back at Clara. He moved his hand, a slow, deliberate gesture, touching his own chest. Nantan, he said. His voice was a deep rumble, vibrating in the floorboards beneath Clara's feet. Clara swallowed dryly. Clara, she whispered. Then, louder. Clara! He watched her mouth form the word. Clara, he repeated. The sound was rough, broken by an accent that had never formed such syllables, but it was gentle. He took a step closer, inspecting the sacks of flour stacked behind her. He reached out a hand. Clara flinched, stepping back. Nantan froze. His hand hovered in the air. He looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. It was not anger she saw, but a flash of hurt, quickly covered. He understood that she was afraid of him. He understood that she saw a monster. He slowly lowered his hand. He turned his face away, exposing the long scar on his jaw to the lantern light. He pointed to the flour, then held up 5 fingers. 5 sacks, Clara said, her voice shaking. For the hides. Nantan nodded once. 5, he said. The air in the room was thick with tension, thick with the unspoken history of blood between their races. Yet, as they stood there, the widow in her calico and the warrior in his buckskin, the silence shifted. It became less about fear and more about a strange, magnetic curiosity. Harlow checked his pocket watch. Good, that is settled. We start the trade tomorrow at dawn, Mrs. Vance. You collect the children at 8 o'clock. Nantan turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused. He looked back at Clara one last time. His expression was unreadable, ancient and stoic, but the intensity of it made Clara's knees weak. Then he was gone. vanishing into the dust of the street. That night, the wind howled around Clara's small cabin on the edge of town. The wooden walls creaked and groaned like a ship at sea. Clara lay in her narrow bed, staring up at the dark rafters. She should have been terrified. She should have been praying for safety. But she was not praying. She was remembering. She replayed the moment in the supply room. She felt the phantom heat of his body standing inches from hers. She saw the size of his hand, scarred and calloused, hovering near her. Are these even real men? The question whispered in the dark, compared to William, who had been soft and pale even before the sickness, compared to her father with his bluster and weakness, compared to the bitter, small-minded men of the town. Nantan was something else entirely. He was a force of nature. Clara turned onto her side, pressing her face into the pillow. Her heart was racing, a traitor in her chest. She felt a strange, hollow ache in her stomach, a mix of fear and a sudden, sharp desire that shocked her with its violence. She touched the ring at her throat, guilt washing over her. But the image of the Apache's dark eyes would not fade. A mile outside of town. The Apache camp was silent save for the crackle of a sparse fire. Nantan sat on a flat rock, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders against the desert chill. His people slept around him, huddled forms seeking warmth in the dust. He looked toward the town. He could see the yellow squares of light from the windows of the wooden houses. It was a place of sickness and greed. He knew the hearts of white men. He had seen them break promises as easily as they broke dry twigs. He had seen them kill women and children for sport. He should hate them all. He did hate them all. But his mind drifted back to the small room, to the smell of lavender water and fear. He remembered the woman, Clara. She had flinched from him. They always flinched. But she had also stood her ground. She had looked him in the eye when the others looked only at his scar or his size. He touched the scar on his jaw absently. Do not trust them, he told himself. The white man's word is smoke. He looked at the distant light that he guessed was her cabin. He remembered the sound of her voice, soft, like water over stones. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind, knowing that tomorrow he would have to walk back into the wolves' den, and knowing, with a heaviness in his gut, that he would look for her face the moment he arrived. The truce was 5 days old, and the peace was as brittle as the dry grass on the prairie. Every morning at 8 o'clock, Clara Vance walked from her cabin to the edge of the Apache encampment near the dry creek bed. The sun was already high enough to burn the back of her neck, a relentless white heat that shimmered off the hard-packed earth. She would wait by the invisible line that separated the town from the temporary reservation, clutching her heavy canvas bag of slate tablets and chalk. The arrangement was simple, or so Captain Harlow claimed. Clara was to escort the 6 Apache children to the schoolhouse, teach them the rudiments of the white man's tongue, and return them before dusk. It was meant to be a gesture of goodwill, a civilized bridge between two worlds that wanted nothing to do with one another. In reality, it was a daily gauntlet. On this Tuesday morning, the air was thick with dust and hostility. As Clara approached the meeting point, she saw them waiting. The children stood in a silent cluster, their dark eyes watchful. They wore leggings and tunics of soft, worn buckskin, their hair black and glossy against the dusty backdrop. And behind them, silent as a mountain, stood Nantan. He did not wave. He simply nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin, acknowledging her presence. He carried a Winchester rifle loosely in the crook of his arm, not threatening, but ready. The army had allowed him to keep it as a guard for the children, a concession that made the townspeople spit in the dirt whenever he passed. "Ready," Clara said, her voice sounding small in the open air. Nantan grunted softly, a sound that might have been yes. He signaled to the children, and they began the walk toward the town. The route to the schoolhouse took them straight down Main Street. There was no other way. As the strange procession entered the town proper, the silence of the morning broke. It was not broken by shouts, but by the heavy, deliberate sounds of rejection, misses. Higgins was sweeping her porch as they approached. She looked up, saw the line of Apache children, and immediately dropped her broom. She turned, grabbed her own daughter, Sarah, who had been playing with a rag doll, and shoved the girl inside the house. The door slammed shut with a crack like a pistol shot. The bolt slid home loud enough for everyone to hear. Clara kept her head high, staring straight ahead, but she felt the flush of heat rise in her cheeks. "Don't look," she whispered to no one in particular, though she knew the Apache children did not understand her. Other doors closed, curtains twitched. Men standing outside the livery stable stopped their work to stare. They did not look at the children with curiosity. They looked at them as one might look at a pack of wolves that had wandered into a parlor. "Look at the little savages," a voice drifted from the shadows of the blacksmith's awning. "Dressed up like people." Clara tightened her grip on her bag. She could feel Nantan walking behind her. His stride was long and silent. He had to hear the slurs. He had to see the way Mr. Henderson turned the sign in the general store window to closed as they passed. Yet Nantan gave no sign. His face was a mask of indifference, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if the town and its petty hatreds were beneath his notice. Then, the procession faltered. One of the children, a boy of perhaps 7 years named Taza, stumbled. He had been born with a twisted foot, and the hard, rutted clay of the street was difficult for him. He fell hard, his small hands scraping against the dirt. A laugh erupted from the boardwalk. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "Trip over your own feet, boy, just like your daddy tripped over the border," a man shouted. Clara spun around, fury flaring in her chest, ready to scold the man as she would a schoolboy. But before she could speak, a shadow fell over Taza. Nantan was there. The giant warrior did not shout back. He did not raise his rifle. He simply crouched down, his massive frame folding with a grace that belied his size. He reached out, and for a heartbeat, the town held its breath, expecting violence. Instead, Nantan's large, scarred hands gently brushed the dust from the boy's knees. He spoke a few soft words in their own tongue, a low, guttural murmur that sounded like water flowing over rock. Then, with an effortless motion, he lifted the boy. He did not drag him. He did not scold him. He lifted Taza onto his left shoulder, settling the boy there as easily as Clara might carry a book. Taza gripped Nantan's thick black hair, his small face breaking into a shy, relieved smile. Nantan stood up. He towered over the street. The boy perched high above the insults of the men on the boardwalk. He looked at the man who had laughed, a drifting ranch hand named Stokes. Nantan's expression was mild, almost pitying. He held the man's gaze until Stokes looked away, spitting tobacco juice on the ground to hide his discomfort. Clara watched, her heart giving a strange, painful lurch. The stories she had been told since she arrived in the West, stories of bloodthirsty monsters, of men who knew only cruelty, cracked and splintered in the face of that single, tender gesture. She looked at Nantan's profile, the sharp line of his nose, the deep scar, the gentleness of his hand resting on the boy's ankle. "Come," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. "We are late." The schoolhouse was an oven. The windows were open, but the air that drifted in was motionless and hot. The 6 Apache children sat on one side of the room. The few white children who had not been pulled out by their parents sat on the other, pressing themselves against the wall as if the aisle between them was a canyon. Clara stood at the blackboard, chalk in hand. "Water," she said, drawing a crude picture of a river. She tapped the slate. "Water." The Apache children watched her with intense, unblinking focus. They did not fidget. They absorbed everything. "Two," a girl in the front row whispered. Clara smiled. "Yes, two, in English. We say water." "Can you say water?" "Water," the girl mimicked, her voice soft. "Good, very good." Clara drew a horse next. "Horse," she said. "Loon," Taza said from his seat, grinning. "Horse," Clara corrected gently. The children giggled. a universal sound that made the room feel suddenly, briefly, like a normal school. They began to point at things, the desk, the window, the flag, and whisper their own words, waiting for Clara to give them the English equivalent. It was a game now, and for a moment, the tension outside the walls ceased to exist. In the back corner of the room, Nantan sat on the floor. There was no chair large enough to hold him, and he seemed to prefer the ground. He sat with his legs crossed, his rifle across his knees, his back against the logs. He did not speak. He did not participate. But Clara could feel his eyes on her. Every time she turned to the board, she felt his gaze on her back. It was not a leering look. It was a steady, heavy weight of observation. He was watching how she moved, how she smiled at the children, how she wiped the chalk dust from her fingers. At one point, she dropped her eraser. It rolled across the floor and stopped near his boot. Clara froze. She had to retrieve it. She walked down the aisle, the rustle of her skirts loud in the quiet room. She stopped in front of him. Nantan looked up close. His eyes were not black, but a deep, dark brown, flecked with gold like visible veins of ore and rock. He reached down and picked up the eraser. His hand engulfed the small object. He held it out to her. His fingers brushed hers as she took it. His skin was rough, dry, and incredibly warm. A shock, like static electricity before a storm, zapped up her arm. "Thank you," she breathed. Nantan nodded. "Teacher," he said. It was the only word he spoke for 3 hours. The weather turned at 2 o'clock. It started with a change in the light. The harsh white glare of the sun took on a sickly, bruised yellow tint. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the west, suddenly died. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Clara looked out the window and gasped. To the south, the horizon had disappeared. In its place was a wall of towering darkness, a solid mass of purple and black that stretched from the earth to the heavens. It was a haboob, a dust storm of biblical proportions, rolling across the plain, swallowing everything in its path. "Children," Clara said, her voice rising in panic. "Pack your things, quickly!" Nantan was already at the window. He said something sharp in Apache, and the children scrambled up, grabbing their blankets. "We have to get them back to the camp," Clara said, rushing to the door. Nantan looked at the approaching wall, then at the distance to the creek. He shook his head. "No time. What? Look!" Clara looked again. The wall was moving with terrifying speed. It was devouring the landscape, the distant hills, the lone cottonwood tree, the road, all vanishing into the churning grit. "We cannot make the town either," Nantan said, his English broken but clear. "Too far. Then where?" Nantan scanned the area. The schoolhouse was isolated, a half-mile from the main cluster of buildings. But near the old dried wash, there was a structure, a half-collapsed sod dugout that had been used for storage years ago. "There," he pointed. He grabbed Taza, swinging the boy onto his back. "Run!" he commanded the others. They ran. Clara gathered her skirts and ran with them, the first gusts of wind hitting her back like physical blows. The sky darkened rapidly, turning a terrifying twilight at mid-afternoon. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds. They reached the dugout just as the monster hit. Nantan shoved the door open, a heavy slab of rotting wood on leather hinges. Inside, he roared over the wind. The children scurried into the darkness. Clara followed, blinded by the flying grit that stung her face like needles. Nantan came in last, fighting the wind to pull the door shut. He slammed the latch home and leaned his weight against the wood as the storm slammed into the structure with the force of a locomotive. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the roar of the wind, a deafening, howling scream that shook the earth. Dust hissed through the cracks in the logs, filling the air with a fine, choking powder. "We are trapped," Clara coughed, pulling her shawl over her nose. Nantan turned from the door. He took a flint and steel from his pouch. In the pitch black, sparks flew, illuminating his grim face. He lit a small lantern that hung on a rusted nail, miraculously. It still had an inch of oil. The amber light pushed back the shadows. The dugout was small, smelling of dry earth and old hay. The children huddled together in the farthest corner, wrapped in their blankets, eyes wide with fear. Nantan moved to check the walls. He was too tall to stand upright. He had to hunch his shoulders, his head brushing the low beams of the roof. The space forced them together. There was nowhere to go. "Sit," Nantan said to Clara, gesturing to a pile of old sacks. Clara sat, her legs trembling. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her cold and shaken. The temperature in the dugout was dropping rapidly as the storm blocked out the sun completely. Nantan checked the children, murmuring soft words of comfort. Then he came and sat opposite Clara, near the small lantern. The space between them was less than 2 feet. The wind howled outside, a demon trying to claw its way in. But inside, in the small circle of yellow light, there was a strange, suspended intimacy. Clara shivered. She was not dressed for the cold. Her calico dress was thin. Nantan saw the shiver. Without a word, he unfastened the heavy wool blanket he wore rolled across his chest. He shook it out. It was patterned with red and black stripes, smelling of wood smoke and horse. He did not hand it to her. He moved closer, sliding on the dirt floor until his knee almost brushed hers. He draped the blanket over her shoulders, and then, seeing the blanket was large enough, he pulled the other end over his own shoulders. They sat tended together under the single piece of wool. Clara stopped breathing for a moment. She was enveloped in his heat. The scent of him was overwhelming, masculine, earthy, foreign yet strangely familiar. "Thank you," she whispered. Nantan nodded. He stared at the lantern flame. "The wind is angry," he said quietly. "It wants to take the land back." Clara looked at his profile. The lantern light cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the scar. "How did you get that?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. Nantan touched the scar. "Soldiers," he said. "Long time ago. I was boy. They come to village, burn corn, burn houses." He paused, his jaw tightening. "My father, he stand in front of wigwam, he say, 'Take the corn, leave the women.' The soldier shot him." Clara gasped softly. I am so sorry." Nantan shrugged, a small movement that pulled the blanket tighter around them. "It is the way of things. The strong eat the weak. Is that what you think?" Clara asked. "That you must be the strong one?" "I must be," he said simply. "Or my people die." He turned his head to look at her. His eyes searched her face. "You have sadness too. Clara, I see it in your eyes, like a ghost." Clara looked down at her hands. She twisted the ring on the leather cord at her neck. "My husband," she said, her voice cracking. "William, he died 2 years ago. The fever. He was a warrior?" Nantan asked. Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. "No, he was a dreamer. He thought the West was a painting. He did not know it was a fight. He faded away, and before him—" She hesitated. Why was she telling this savage, this stranger, things she had never told the women in town? "My father," she continued, the words spilling out. "He was not a good man. He drank. He was angry. He wanted a son. And he got me. I came here to be free of him. But sometimes I feel I just traded one prison for another." She looked up at him. "I do not belong here. Nantan, I am terrified every day." Nantan looked at her. His face softened. The stern warrior vanished, replaced by a man who understood the language of loss. "You belong where you stand," he said firmly. "You are strong. You look at me. You do not look down. That is strong." He reached out his hand. He meant to adjust the blanket, to pull it closer to her neck to shield her from a draft coming through the wall. His fingers brushed her collarbone. Clara froze. The touch was electric. It was not the rough grab of a man taking what he wanted. It was a touch of reverence. His hand lingered near her neck. He did not pull away. Clara looked at his hand. Dark, scarred, dangerous, resting so close to her pale skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She should move. She should slap his hand away. She was a decent Christian woman, and he was an Apache warrior. But she did not move. Instead, She felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a fierce, aching safety that confused her. With William, she had felt needed. With Nantan, she felt seen and protected. She looked up into his eyes. They were inches apart. The dust swirled in the air between them, caught in the lantern light like golden motes. The wind howled outside, but in the dugout, the silence was deafening. Nantan leaned in, just a fraction. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The question was there, raw and unspoken. The forbidden pull of two lonely souls finding an anchor in the storm. Clara felt her breath hitch. A fierce compulsion seized her, to lean forward, to close the tiny gap, to taste the dust and smoke on his skin. Guilt twisted in her gut. Guilt for William. Guilt for her race. Guilt for the God she prayed to. But the desire was stronger. It was a physical pain, a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. Nantan, she whispered. He froze. Her voice seemed to break the spell, or perhaps it warned him of the cliff they were about to ride over. He closed his eyes for a second, inhaling sharply through his nose. His hand clenched into a fist near her neck, then slowly, agonizingly, he pulled it back. He turned his head away, staring back at the lantern. "Sleep, Clara," he said, his voice rougher than before. "The storm will last until sun comes." He did not move away, but the wall was back up. He sat rigid, a statue of stone, guarding her from the wind and from himself. Clara pulled her knees to her chest, her cheek burning. She watched him for a long time, watching the rise and fall of his chest, until exhaustion finally pulled her into a fitful sleep. Dawn brought a pale, washed-out light. The wind had died, leaving behind a silence that felt ringing and empty. Clara woke with a stiff neck. She was leaning against Nantan's shoulder. She jerked upright, panic flaring. He was already awake. He was staring at the door. "We go now," he said. He stood up, stooping low, and kicked the door open. The world outside was unrecognizable. Drifts of sand piled against the walls. The sky was a pale, innocent blue, scrubbed clean of clouds. They walked back to town in silence. The children were groggy, stumbling through the new dunes. Clara walked beside Nantan, but he felt miles away. He kept a deliberate distance between them, 3 feet of empty air that felt like a chasm. He did not look at her. He scanned the horizon, his face set in hard lines. It was as if the intimacy of the dark, the shared blanket, the near touch, had been a dream. As they reached the edge of town, the reality of the daylight hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. People were coming out of their houses to inspect the damage. They saw the group approaching, the Apache warrior and the white schoolteacher, walking out of the wilderness together after a night alone. Clara saw Mrs. Higgins standing on her porch. The woman's hand went to her mouth. She whispered something to her husband. "Mr." Broderick was riding down the street on his gray stallion. He pulled up, watching them. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. "Well now," Broderick called out, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "Look what the wind blew in. You look a mite disheveled. Mrs. Vance kept you warm, did he?" Clara stopped. Her face went white, then flooded with a burning, humiliating red. A few men near the saloon laughed. It was a low, dirty sound. "I bet he did," one of them muttered. "A big buck like that? Probably split her in 2. Clara felt the ground sway beneath her feet. The crude, violent imagery made her stomach turn. She looked at Nantan. He had stopped. His knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. He understood. God help them. He understood every word. He turned slowly toward the men. The laughter died instantly. Nantan took 1 step toward them, his eyes blazing with a murderous light. "No!" Clara hissed. "Nantan, no, please!" She grabbed his arm. It was like grabbing an iron bar. "Do not give them the excuse," she begged. "Just go, please!" Nantan looked down at her hand on his arm. He looked at her pleading, terrified eyes. He vibrated with tension, a coiled spring ready to snap. Then, with a visible effort of will that shook his entire frame, he stepped back. He looked at Broderick, then at the laughing men. He spat on the ground in front of them. Then he turned and walked away, leading the children toward the reservation line. He did not look back at Clara. The reprimand came an hour later. Captain Harlow sat behind his desk at the small fort headquarters, tapping a pen against an inkwell. Clara stood before him, her hands clasped, trying to keep her dignity despite the dust still clinging to her hem. It was careless. "Mrs. Vance," Harlow said, not looking up. "Extremely careless. It was a storm." "Captain," Clara said, her voice steady. "We took shelter. Nothing happened." Harlow looked up then. His eyes were cold and pragmatic. "It does not matter what happened. It matters what people think happened. You have compromised your position. The town is talking. They are saying you are overly familiar with the savages." "I was saving the children," Clara said, "and he saved me." Harlow waved a hand dismissively. Yes, he is a noble savage. I know the romantic notions. But listen to me, Clara." He leaned forward. "This familiarity, it might be useful." Clara frowned. "Useful?" "Broderick is stirring up trouble. He wants the water rights. He claims the Apache are raiding his cattle. I need to know what Nantan thinks. I need to know if they are planning to fight or run." He smiled, a thin, oily expression. "If the savage trusts you, perhaps you can listen. Find out where their weapon caches are. Find out if other bands are joining them." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You want me to spy on him?" "I want you to help keep the peace," Harlow said. "Use his affection for the greater good." Clara took a step back. She felt dirty, used. The town thought she was a whore. The captain thought she was a tool. "I am a school teacher, captain, not a spy." Harlow shrugged. "You are a widow with no money and a ruined reputation. You will do what is necessary. You are dismissed." That night, the air was cool and clear. At the Apache camp, the fires burned low. Nantan sat by the largest fire, sharpening his knife. The stone rasped against the metal. Two of the elders sat across from him. One of them, an old man named Cochise, a cousin to the great chief, watched him with clouded eyes. The white woman, the elders said in their tongue, "You spend too much time with her. She teaches the children," Nantan said, not looking up. "She is one of them," the elder said. "They are all the same. They lie. They take. When the soldiers come to kill us, she will stand with them." Nantan stopped sharpening the knife. He tested the edge against his thumb. A thin line of blood appeared. "She is not like them," Nantan said quietly. "She has a spirit that fights. She makes you weak." The elder spat. "You look at her and you forget your anger." "We need your anger, Nantan. It is the only shield we have." Nantan did not answer. He sheathed the knife. He felt the conflict tearing him apart. The loyalty to the blood of his fathers, and the quiet, stubborn fascination with the woman who had slept under his blanket. Clara stood at the window of her cabin. She had not lit a lamp. She did not want the town to see her. She looked out across the dark plain. In the distance, against the black silhouette of the hills, she could see the faint orange pinpricks of the Apache fires. She touched her lips. She could still feel the phantom warmth of his breath. She could still hear the crude words the men had spoken. "Giant Apache. Split her in two." She burned with shame, but beneath the shame, deeper and more dangerous, something else was simmering. She remembered his hands on the blanket. She remembered the way he had stood between her and the storm. She remembered the look in his eyes, not a look of conquest, but of recognition. She closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against the cool glass. "God forgive me," she whispered into the dark. She wasn't praying for forgiveness for what had happened. She was praying for forgiveness for what she wanted to happen. Because as she watched the distant fire, she knew she would walk through the hatred and the dust all over again, just to sit beside him one more time. The drought hardened into a distinct, living malice as August arrived. The earth cracked open like a dry bone, exposing fissures that ran deep into the thirsty soil. The creek had long since retreated to a series of unconnected, stagnant puddles, and the cattle were beginning to drop. their carcasses bloated in the sun, black with flies, until the ranch hands dragged them into heaps to be burned. The smoke from these pyres hung over Bitter Creek, a greasy, sweet-smelling pall that coated the back of the throat. Tension, thick and volatile as black powder, filled the vacuum left by the water. It began with the missing stock. 10 head of cattle from the Broderick Ranch vanished overnight. Then a prize mare from the livery stable. The whispers started immediately, hissing through the town like a snake in dry grass. It was the Apache. It had to be. They were hungry. They were savages. The truce was a trick. Then came the morning that shattered the fragile peace entirely. A drifting prospector, riding in from the northern rise, brought the news. He was pale beneath his sunburn, his hands shaking as he drank whiskey at the bar at 9 in the morning. He had passed the sod house of the homesteaders, the O'Connell family. 5 miles out, dead. The prospector choked out. Every one of them. Scalped, arrows sticking out of the door frame like a pincushion. The town did not wait for proof. The town did not wait for the army to investigate. Panic and rage erupted instantly. Men ran for their rifles. Women gathered their children, weeping hysterically. The fear that had been simmering for weeks boiled over into a demand for blood. That night, the town meeting was held in the Golden Steer Saloon, the only building large enough to hold the angry mob. The air inside was stifling, smelling of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and fear. Captain Harlow stood on a crate near the bar, trying to shout over the din. "Order!" Harlow bellowed. His face flushed. "I will have order. We do not know who is responsible yet. We know who it is," a man shouted from the back. "It is those red devils you let camp on our doorstep." Elias Broderick stood near the piano. He was calm, cool, a stark contrast to the sweating, shouting crowd. He raised a hand, and the room quieted, deferring to his wealth and power. "Captain," Broderick said, his voice smooth and carrying, "we found Apache arrows in the O'Connell's door. We found their tracks. My cattle are gone. Now a good Christian family lies dead. How much more proof do you need? You brought wolves into the sheepfold, and now you are surprised the lambs are being slaughtered." A roar of agreement went up. "Kill them! Drive them out!" Clara stood in the far corner, pressed against the rough wood of the wall. She felt sick. Her heart hammered against her ribs until she thought it might bruise them. She had seen Nantan that morning. She had seen the Apache men repairing their shelters, weaving baskets, enduring the heat with stoic patience. They had not left their designated camp. She looked at the faces around her, faces she knew. Mr. Henderson, the grocer, Mrs. Higgins, people she traded with, people she taught. They were twisted into masks of hatred so pure it was terrifying. She could not stay silent. The image of the O'Connell children was horrible. Yes, but the image of Nantan and the little lame boy, Taza, being massacred by this mob was equally unbearable. "Wait!" Her voice was high and trembling, but it cut through a lull in the shouting. Heads turned. Broderick looked at her with narrowed eyes. Clara stepped forward, her hands clenching her skirt. "It could not have been Nantan's people," she said, her voice shaking. "And how would you know? School teacher?" A man sneered. "Because I was there," Clara said, forcing strength into her spine. "I was at the reservation line yesterday evening. I saw the men. They were cooking. They were singing. They did not ride out. The O'Connell farm is 10 miles away. They could not have done it and been back by dawn without exhausted horses. And their ponies were fresh this morning." Silence fell over the room. It was not a respectful silence. It was heavy, judgmental, and dangerous. Broderick took a step toward her. He smiled, but it was a wolf's smile. "You seem to know a great deal about the habits of these savages. Mrs. Vance," he said softly, "you spend a lot of time out there, walking with them, hiding in caves with them." The crowd murmured. The rumors that had been whispered were now being spoken aloud. "I am doing my job," Clara said, though her face burned. "The army pays me to—" "The army pays you to teach, not to whore, Mrs." Higgins shrieked from the front row. The word hung in the air, ugly and brutal. Clara recoiled as if she had been slapped. "She is tainted!" another woman yelled. "She has let that giant buck turn her head. She is defending murderers because she is soft on them." "Soft!" a man laughed harshly. "She is likely more than soft. Shame, hot and agonizing, flooded Clara's veins." She looked at Captain Harlow, pleading for him to intervene, to defend her honor. Harlow looked away, studying his boots. He would not risk the town's wrath for her. She was alone. Broderick leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried to the corners of the room. "Maybe you should go join them. Mrs. Vance," he said, "if you love them so much, but do not expect us to listen to a woman who has forgotten her own race." The laughter that followed was cruel and dismissive. Tears pricked Clara's eyes. Tears of rage, not weakness. She looked at the hateful faces one last time, turned on her heel, and pushed her way out the swinging doors. The night air was cool compared to the saloon, but it gave her no relief. She stumbled down the boardwalk, blinded by tears, gasping for breath. She felt dirty. The accusations clung to her skin like mud. She turned the corner toward the livery stable, seeking the darkness of the alley to hide her weeping. She almost ran into him. A massive shadow detached itself from the wall of the stable. Clara gasped, stepping back, her hand flying to her throat. It was Nantan. He stood perfectly still, wrapped in a dark blanket that made him nearly invisible in the gloom. He was looking at the saloon, listening to the muffled shouts of the mob. "Clara," he said. His voice was a low rumble, grounded and real. Clara wiped her eyes frantically, humiliated that he should see her like this. "Nantan, you should not be here. If they find you, they speak of blood," Nantan said. He did not move, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. "They blame us for the dead family." "Yes," Clara whispered. "And you?" Nantan asked. He looked down at her, his eyes searching her face in the moonlight. "Do you blame us?" "No," Clara said. The word was a sob. "I told them. I tried to tell them." Nantan watched her. He reached out a hand, hesitating, then let it drop to his side. "They did not listen. They called me—" Clara choked on the words. "They said I was tainted. Because of you." Nantan's jaw tightened. The scar on his face stood out in stark relief. "They hate what they do not understand," he said quietly. "And they hate what they fear. They fear you." "Clara, fear me?" Clara let out a watery, bitter laugh. "I am a widow schoolteacher. I have nothing—" "You have eyes that see the truth," Nantan said. "That is dangerous to men like Broderick." He stepped closer. The smell of him, wood smoke, sage, and man, washed over her, grounding her. "Go home," he said gently. "Lock your door. Do not fight them tonight." "What will you do?" Clara asked, fear gripping her again. "They want to kill you." Nantan looked toward the saloon, where the shouting was growing louder. "Let them come," he said. "I will be ready." He turned and melted back into the shadows, silent as a ghost. Clara stood alone in the alley, her heart aching with a mixture of terror for him and a profound, isolating grief for herself. She had never felt less at home among her own people. 2 days later, the army organized a supply run to Miller's Creek, a jagged ravine 20 miles to the west where the water still ran deep enough to fill barrels. The town's wells were sputtering mud. Captain Harlow ordered Nantan and 2 of his best trackers to accompany the wagons as guides and guards. It was a calculated risk. Harlow knew Broderick's men wouldn't attack a convoy guarded by soldiers, and he needed the Apache to find the quickest route through the Badlands. Clara was ordered to go. Harlow claimed he needed her to translate for the guides, but Clara suspected he simply wanted her out of town to let the tempers cool. The journey was brutal. The sun hammered down on the canvas covers of the 3 wagons. The land was a broken jaw of rock and scrub brush, gullies cut deep by ancient floods, now bone-dry and infested with rattlesnakes. Clara rode in the lead wagon, sitting on the buckboard bench beside a young private named Jenkins. Nantan rode ahead on his roan horse, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the ridge lines. He had not spoken to her since the night behind the livery. He kept his distance, playing the part of the stoic scout, but Clara felt his presence like a physical tether. By noon, the heat was dizzying. The horizon shivered. The only sound was the creak of the wagon wheels and the crunch of hooves on gravel. They reached a narrow pass known as Devil's Elbow. The trail narrowed dangerously, with a sheer drop of 50 feet on the left side down to a rocky dry wash. To the right, the canyon wall rose steeply. "Careful here." "Private," Nantan said, dropping back to ride beside the lead wagon. "The earth is loose. I know how to drive a wagon." "Indian," Jenkins muttered, wiping sweat from his eyes. Clara gripped the bench rail. She looked down at the drop. The rocks below looked sharp and unforgiving. Suddenly, a sound erupted from the brush on the right, the dry, terrifying buzz of a diamondback rattlesnake. The lead horse, a nervous gelding, screamed and reared. Jenkins shouted, hauling on the reins, but he was too slow. The horse slammed sideways into the tracemate. The wagon lurched violently to the left. The rear wheel slipped over the edge of the trail. The world tilted. Clara screamed as the wagon groaned and tipped. Gravity took hold. She was thrown from the bench, not toward the road, but toward the open air and the drop. She clawed at the air, expecting the fall, expecting the bone-shattering impact. Instead, she hit something solid and warm. Nantan had launched himself from his horse. He collided with her in mid-air, wrapping his massive arms around her waist. His momentum carried them both away from the wagon, but they hit the steep slope of the wash together. They rolled. The world became a chaotic blur of sky, dust, and rock. Clara felt hard stones bruising her ribs, the scratch of brush, but mostly she felt him. Nantan took the brunt of every impact. He curled his body around hers, tucking her head into his shoulder, shielding her with his own bulk. They tumbled down the slope, a tangle of limbs and dust, sliding 20 feet before coming to a jarring halt in a patch of soft sand at the bottom of the wash. Silence followed, broken only by the distant shouts of the soldiers on the road above. Clara lay still, gasping for breath. She was pinned beneath him. Nantan lay half over her, his weight heavy and crushing, his legs entangled with hers. "Are you hurt?" he rasped. Clara opened her eyes. His face was inches from hers. A cut on his forehead was bleeding, the red blood stark against his dark skin. His hair had come loose, falling around them like a curtain, shutting out the sun. "No," she whispered. I don't think so." She became acutely, overwhelmingly aware of their position. His chest was heaving against hers, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm that matched her own. One of his thighs was pressed between hers. His arm was banded tight around her waist. His hand splayed across her back. The fear of death evaporated, replaced instantly by a different kind of shock. The heat of his body burned through her layers of petticoats and calico. She could feel the hard muscle beneath his buckskin shirt. Nantan did not move. He stared down at her, his eyes wide, the pupils blown black. The adrenaline of the rescue was crashing into something else, the raw, undeniable reality of her body beneath his. Clara's hands, which had been clutching his shirt for dear life, did not let go. Her fingers curled into the fabric. A flood of heat started in her belly and flushed through her entire body, leaving her trembling. It was wrong. It was forbidden. It was the most powerful thing she had ever felt. Nantan. She breathed. The sound of his name seemed to snap a chord in him. His jaw tightened. His eyes dropped to her lips, lingered there with a hunger that was terrifying in its intensity, and then flashed with conflict. He pushed himself up, scrambling backward as if he had been burned. He stood up, breathing hard, dusting himself off with jerky, angry movements. He offered her a hand, but he did not look at her. "Get up," he said roughly. "The others come." Clara took his hand. He pulled her to her feet with effortless strength, but the moment she was upright, he dropped her hand and stepped back, putting 5 feet of distance between them. The soldiers were scrambling down the slope. "Mrs. Vance!" Jenkins shouted. "Are you alive?" "I am fine," Clara called back, her voice shaking. "The scout, he saved me." She looked at Nantan. He was staring at the canyon wall, his face a mask of stone, ignoring her completely. But she saw his hand, hanging by his side, opening and closing into a fist, as if trying to grasp something that was already gone. They camped that night at the bottom of Miller's Creek. The water was muddy, but it was wet. The soldiers filled the barrels while the sun set in a blaze of blood red and violet. The mood in the camp was subdued. The near disaster had sobered everyone. The soldiers ate their beans and hardtack near the wagons, casting wary glances at the darkness beyond the firelight. Clara sat apart, near the edge of the creek bed. She could not stop trembling. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the fall again, felt the weight of Nantan's body pressing her into the earth. She heard soft footsteps. She did not need to look to know who it was. Nantan sat down on a flat rock a few yards away. He began to clean his rifle, the rhythmic click-clack of the lever the only sound. "You are bleeding," Clara said softly. Nantan touched the cut on his forehead. The blood had dried. "It is nothing. It is not nothing," Clara said. "You saved my life." Again. She stood up and walked over to him. She had a clean handkerchief dipped in the cool water of the creek. "Let me," she said. Nantan froze. He looked up at her. For a moment, she thought he would refuse, tell her to go away, but he slowly lowered the rifle. Clara stepped between his spread knees. She reached out and gently dabbed the dried blood from his temple. He hissed in a breath, but did not pull away. His eyes were level with her chest. He kept them fixed resolutely on the horizon, refusing to look at her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. "Why do you do it?" Clara whispered, her hand trembling against his skin. "Why do you save me? You hate us. You said so." Nantan closed his eyes. The mask cracked. "I try to hate you," he said, his voice a low growl. "I want to hate you. When I see the blue coats, I see fire. I see my mother weeping. I see my father dying in the dirt. I want to kill them all. I want to burn their towns and leave nothing but ash." He opened his eyes and looked up at her. The pain in them was bottomless. "But then I see you. You stand in the storm. You stand in the room of angry men and speak for me. You look at me and you do not see a monster. You see a man." He shook his head slowly. "It confuses my anger. Clara, it makes my hand shake." A warrior cannot have a shaking hand. Clara's heart broke for him. She dropped the handkerchief. She placed her hand on his cheek, her thumb tracing the line of the old scar. "I was the same," she confessed, her voice barely audible over the sound of the crickets. "When I came west, I was told stories. I was told you were devils. I was told you had no souls." She leaned closer, drawn by a gravity she could no longer resist. "I was wrong. I look at the men in town, Broderick, Harlow, and I see emptiness. I look at you, and I feel safe. I feel—" She couldn't say the word loved. It was too dangerous. "I feel drawn to you," she whispered, "in a way I have never felt, not with William, not with anyone." The admission hung between them, naked and terrifying. Nantan raised his hand. He covered her hand on his cheek, pressing it closer. He turned his face into her palm, inhaling sharply. "Clara," he groaned. He leaned forward. Clara leaned down. Their faces were inches apart. She could see the gold flecks in his eyes, the fine lines of exhaustion around them. She could feel his breath, warm and smelling of coffee, on her lips. The world narrowed down to this single point of contact. The danger, the town, the hatred. It all fell away. There was only the firelight, the vast, indifferent sky, and the man who made her feel alive for the first time in years. Clara closed her eyes, tilting her head. Nantan's hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. "Hey, who goes there?" The shout from the sentry by the wagons shattered the moment like glass. Nantan ripped himself away. He was on his feet in a blur of motion, his rifle leveled at the darkness. Instantly the warrior again. Clara stumbled back, gasping, her hand flying to her mouth. It was nothing, just a coyote. Jenkins called out from the darkness. "False alarm." Nantan did not relax. He stood rigid, his back to Clara. His breathing was ragged. He did not turn around. He did not look at her. "Go to sleep, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice cold and flat. "We ride at dawn." The use of her formal name was a door slamming in her face. Clara stood there for a moment, her lips tingling with the ghost of a kiss that hadn't happened, before turning and fleeing to her bedroll, where she lay awake until the sun rose, staring at the unforgiving stars. The return trip was torture. The physical distance between them was restored, but the air was thick with what had almost happened. Nantan rode far ahead, a silhouette against the glare. Clara sat on the wagon bench, hollowed out by lack of sleep and the agonizing ache of unfulfilled desire. When they rolled back into Bitter Creek 2 days later, the town felt different. The anger was still there, but it had curdled into a watchful, sinister suspicion. As the wagons pulled up to the supply depot, people stopped to watch. They saw Clara climb down, dusty and exhausted. They saw Nantan sitting on his horse nearby, watching her ensure she was safe before turning away. They saw the way he looked at her. They saw the way she looked at him. It was subtle, a glance, a hesitation, but to the prying eyes of a small town, it was a confession. "Look at them, Mrs." Higgins whispered to her neighbor. "Look at how she looks at him, like a lovesick calf." "It is unnatural," the neighbor agreed. "It is an abomination." From the balcony of the hotel, Elias Broderick watched the scene unfold. He was smoking a cigar, the smoke curling blue in the still air. He saw the tension in Nantan's shoulders. He saw the flush on Clara's cheeks. He smiled. He had been looking for a way to break the truce once and for all. He had been looking for the spark that would ignite the powder keg and force the army to wipe the Apache out. He had thought it would be stolen cattle. He had thought it would be a dead family. But this was better. This was personal. "Forbidden love," Broderick murmured to himself, tapping ash onto the railing. "The oldest sin, and the most dangerous." He watched Nantan ride toward the reservation line. He watched Clara walk alone toward her cabin, her head bowed. If he could catch them, prove it, show the town that their white woman was laying with the savage, the mob wouldn't just drive the Apache out, they would tear them to pieces. Broderick turned and walked back into his room. He had a plan to make, and he knew exactly which thread to pull to unravel everything. The mid-August heat in Bitter Creek was a physical weight, pressing down on the roofs and the hats of men until tempers snapped like dry twigs. The truce, already frayed by suspicion and the machinations of Elias Broderick, finally tore apart on a Tuesday afternoon. It began with the distant, popping sound of gunfire to the south, near the dry wash of the creek. It was not the rhythmic, heavy report of soldiers at practice, but the ragged, chaotic exchange of a skirmish. Clara Vance was in the schoolhouse, wiping the slate boards clean. She froze, the chalk cloth in her hand turning gray with dust. The few children remaining in her class looked up, their eyes wide. "Stay here," Clara commanded, her voice sharp with a fear she could not hide. "Do not go near the door." She stepped out onto the porch. The town was already moving. Men were running toward the livery, buckling gun belts. Women were pulling shutters closed. 20 minutes later, a wagon rolled into the main street. It was driven by a terrified young private from the fort, his uniform dusty and stained. Behind the wagon rode Captain Harlow and a detachment of 6 troopers, their faces grim and pale. But it was what lay in the back of the wagon that stopped the breath in Clara's throat. There were 4 bodies. They were piled carelessly, like sacks of grain. They were not white men. They were Apache. Clara ran. She forgot her dignity. She forgot the eyes of the town. She ran past the saloon, past the general store, her skirts kicking up yellow dust. She reached the wagon just as it halted in front of the Army headquarters. A crowd had gathered, a tight circle of morbid curiosity and rising anger. Clara pushed through them. "What happened?" she demanded. Gripping the side of the wagon, Captain Harlow dismounted. He looked rattled. He took off his hat and wiped his forehead, leaving a streak of dirt. "Renegades," Harlow said loudly, addressing the crowd more than Clara. "We came upon a hunting party. They were armed. They fired on my patrol. We had no choice but to return fire. It is a lie. The voice was a thunderclap. The crowd parted instinctively. Nantan strode into the circle. He had come from the reservation line, followed by a dozen Apache warriors. They were not armed with rifles, but their hands hovered near their knives. Nantan looked at the wagon. He looked at the bodies. His face, usually a mask of stoic reserve, crumbled into a raw, open expressions of grief that was terrifying to witness. He walked to the wagon. A soldier moved to block him. Raising a carbine, "Let him pass," Clara shouted. Harlow signaled the soldier to stand down. Nantan reached into the wagon bed. He did not look at the three men. He reached for the smallest form, a body tucked in the corner, half covered by a bloody blanket. He pulled the blanket back. Clara covered her mouth with both hands to stifle a scream. It was Taza, the boy with the twisted foot, the boy who had smiled when he learned the word for horse. He lay still, his small chest shattered by a bullet. His eyes were open, staring up at the blinding white sun. Nantan lifted the boy's hand. It was clenched tight in a death grip, gently, with the fingers that trembled. Nantan pried the small fist open. A scrap of paper fluttered to the ground. Clara stared at it. It was a drawing, a crude, charcoal sketch of a bird that she had drawn for him just 2 days ago. "Bird," she had written beneath it, "fly." The sight of that paper, stained with the boy's blood, cracked something inside Clara. It broke the vessel of her fear and left only a burning, molten rage. They were hunting rabbits. Nantan roared. He spun on Harlow, his size seeming to double. Taza had no gun. He had a sling for rocks. "You kill children and call it battle?" Harlow stepped back, his hand dropping to the holster at his hip. "They were outside the boundary," Harlow shouted, his voice cracking. "They were armed. My men reported seeing army carbines. They were wearing blue coats. Lies." Nantan stepped forward. He pointed a shaking finger at the wagon. "Look at the wounds. Look at the tracks. You say army carbines? I saw the men who rode away. They wore blue coats, yes, but they rode spotted horses. They rode with the brand of the double bar. The double bar. Elias Broderick's brand." A murmur went through the crowd. Broderick, standing on the boardwalk in his fine suit, did not flinch. He shook his head sadly. "The savage is confused," Broderick said smoothly. "Or he is lying to cover his own treachery. Why would my men hurt a child?" It was a tragic mistake, likely caused by the heat and the tension these people brought with them. "You lie." Nantan lunged. It happened in a blur. Nantan moved with the speed of a striking snake, reaching for Harlow's throat. Harlow panicked, drawing his revolver. The soldiers raised their rifles. The Apache warriors behind Nantan drew their knives. In 1 second, the street was going to turn into a slaughterhouse. "Stop!" Clara threw herself between them. She did not think. She simply moved. She stood with her back to Nantan's heaving chest, facing the barrel of Captain Harlow's Colt revolver. "Clara, move!" Harlow shouted, his hands shaking. "No!" Clara screamed. She spread her arms, shielding Nantan's body with her own. "Do not shoot! If you shoot him, you have to shoot me." The town went silent. The image was stark and shocking. The white schoolteacher protecting the Apache warrior, her calico dress pressed against his buckskin, her face twisted with desperate defiance. Nantan froze. He looked down at the top of her head. He could feel her trembling against him. He could smell the lavender soap she used, mixed with the metallic scent of blood from the wagon. Clara turned her head, looking up at him. Her eyes were swimming with tears, but her voice was fierce. "Nantan, please," she whispered. "Do not give them the excuse. If you kill him now, they will kill everyone. They will kill the elders. They will kill the babies. Please." Nantan looked at Harlow. He looked at Broderick, who was watching with a cold, disappointed sneer. He realized, with a sickening jolt, that this was exactly what Broderick wanted. He wanted Nantan to attack. He wanted a massacre. Nantan's chest heaved. He slowly lowered his hands. He looked at Taza's body one last time. Then he looked at Clara. "Take the boy," he said in Apache to his warriors. The warriors moved forward, lifting the small bodies from the wagon with tender reverence. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence. Nantan stepped back from Clara. He looked at Harlow with eyes that promised a reckoning. Not of law, but of spirit. "This is not over," Nantan said. He turned and followed his people, walking through the dust with his head high, leaving Clara standing alone in the center of the street, shivering in the heat. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The Apache elders met that night. The drums did not beat. They were silent. They decided the truce was dead. The white men had killed a child. There could be no peace. They began to pack their camps, preparing to move at dawn, to flee into the Dragoon Mountains where the cavalry could not take wagons. For Clara, the town's judgment was swift. She was summoned to the fort an hour after the incident. Harlow sat behind his desk, drinking whiskey. "You will write a report." "Mrs. Vance," Harlow said, not offering her a seat. "You will witness that the hostiles were aggressive. You will witness that Nantan threatened an officer of the United States Army." "I will not," Clara said. Her voice was quiet but steady. Harlow looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Excuse me, I will write the truth," Clara said. "I will write that Taza was 7 years old. I will write that he was holding a drawing of a bird. I will write that Nantan was provoked by the murder of a child." Harlow slammed his glass down. "You are a schoolteacher. Clara, you are a citizen of this town. You are not a judge. If you write that report, you call me a murderer. You call the army incompetent, if the shoe fits." "Captain," Clara said. Harlow stood up, his face purple. Get out of my office, and do not expect to be paid for this week. Do not expect anything from me ever again." Clara walked out, but the punishment did not end there. As she walked back to her cabin, she passed Mrs. Higgins. The woman spat on the ground in front of Clara's boots. "Traitor." Mrs. Higgins hissed. "Indian lover." By evening, the parents of 5 children had come to her cabin to tell her that their sons and daughters would not be returning to school. They did not look her in the eye. They looked at their feet, muttering about bad influences and safety. When the sun went down, Clara bolted her door. She sat in a rocking chair, the silence of the empty cabin pressing in on her. She felt like a leper. She had done the right thing, the Christian thing, the moral thing, and for it, she had lost her livelihood and her community. But worse than the isolation was the grief. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Taza's hand opening. She saw the scrap of paper. She saw the light gone from his eyes. She began to weep. It started as a silent leaking of tears, but soon it grew into great, racking sobs that shook her frame. She cried for Taza. She cried for William. She cried for the sheer, crushing unfairness of the world. She did not hear the footsteps outside. She did not hear the latch lift. The door opened. A gust of wind blew the lamp flame sideways, casting wild shadows. Clara gasped, jumping up, grabbing a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. "It is me!" Nantan stood in the doorway. He filled the frame, a silhouette against the stars. Clara dropped the poker. It clattered on the wood floor. Nantan. He stepped inside and closed the door. He should not be here. If Broderick's men saw him, they would shoot him on sight. If the town saw him entering her cabin at night, they would burn it down with her inside. "You cannot be here," Clara whispered, wiping her face frantically. "It is too dangerous. I could not stay away," Nantan said. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. He walked toward her. He looked exhausted. The grief etched into his face made him look 10 years older. He had washed the war paint from his face, leaving his skin bare and vulnerable. Clara looked at him, and all her warnings died in her throat. She saw the pain in his eyes, pain that mirrored her own. "They killed him," Nantan whispered. He was small. He could not run. "Oh, Nantan?" Clara sobbed. She took a step toward him. He took a step toward her, and then the distance vanished. He reached for her, not with the hesitation of the past weeks, but with a desperate, starving need. His arms went around her, pulling her against him so hard the air was knocked from her lungs. Clara buried her face in his chest. She grabbed handfuls of his buckskin shirt, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "I am sorry." She wept into his shirt. "I am so sorry." Nantan buried his face in her hair. He was trembling. The great, stoic warrior was shaking like a leaf. "You saved me today," he murmured against her ear. "You stood in front of the gun." "Why?" "Because I could not watch you die," Clara said. "I could not bear it." Nantan pulled back, just enough to look at her face. His hands framed her cheeks, his thumbs wiping away the tears. His touch was calloused and rough, but his palms were incredibly warm. "Clara," he said. Her name sounded like a prayer on his lips. He looked at her mouth. The question was gone. There was only the answer. He lowered his head. Clara rose on her toes to meet him. The kiss was not gentle. It was not the chaste, polite kiss of a courtship. It was a collision. It was desperate, salty with tears, and fierce with the knowledge of death waiting outside the door. Clara opened her mouth to him, a gasp of surrender. Nantan groaned low in his throat, his arms tightening around her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor. His mouth was hot, demanding, tasting of grief and desire. Clara's hands moved to his shoulders, then up to his neck, her fingers tangling in his thick, black hair. She felt the heavy beat of his heart hammering against her own chest. Thump, 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 a rhythm of life defying the silence of the grave. They stumbled backward, away from the door, until Clara's back hit the rough logs of the wall. Nantan pressed his body against hers, his hips pinning her, his weight overwhelming and perfect. The intimacy was searing. They were fully clothed, layers of wool and leather and cotton between them. Yet Clara felt naked. She felt the heat of his thighs, the hardness of his chest, the sheer, masculine power of him. It was a physical ache, a longing that had been building since the first moment she saw him on his horse. She wanted him. She wanted to pull him down onto the narrow bed and forget the town, the army, and the future. She wanted to lose herself in him. Nantan broke the kiss, gasping for air. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed, his lashes dark against his cheek. "Clara," he whispered roughly. "My heart." Clara trembled, her hand still clutching his neck. "I love you," she whispered. The words slipped out, unplanned, terrifying, and true. Nantan went still. He opened his eyes. They were dark pools of tenderness and agony. "And you," he said. "I have walked in the dark for many years. You are the only light I have found." He kissed her again, softer this time, a lingering seal on the confession. But then he pulled back, his jaw tightening. He stepped away, leaving Clara cold against the wall. He paced the small room, running a hand through his hair. "This is dangerous," he said. "If they find out—" "I do not care," Clara said fiercely. "Let them talk. They will do more than talk. Clara, they will hurt you. To hurt me." He turned to her. His face was tortured. "I would rather face 100 rifles than see you hurt because of me." "Then take me with you," Clara said. "When you leave, take me." Nantan looked at her sadly. "Where we go, it is not a place for you. We go to the rocks, we go to starve, we go to fight. You would die, Clara, and if you died, I would have nothing left to fight for." Clara knew he was right. She was a woman of the town, soft despite her spirit. She could not live on the run, hunting lizards and dodging cavalry patrols. "So this is it?" she asked, her voice breaking. "We just stop?" Nantan walked back to her. He took her hands in his. "We do not stop," he said intensely. "What is in here?" He touched his chest. "Does not stop, but we must survive." He held her for a long time in the dim light. They did not speak. They just stood there, swaying slightly, memorizing the feel of the other, the height, the scent, the beat of the heart. It was a goodbye, and they both knew it. The sun rose on a world that had turned gray. A messenger from the fort arrived at the Apache camp at dawn. He did not bring an offer of peace. He brought an order. The Department of the Interior had issued a decree. The Chiricahua band was to be relocated immediately, not to the mountains, as the elders had planned, but to the San Carlos Reservation, a hellhole of alkali flats and malaria 300 miles to the east. They were to move under armed guard. Any Apache found off the trail would be shot. Nantan stood before the messenger. He gripped his rifle until the wood creaked. He wanted to fight. Every instinct in his blood screamed to fight. But he looked at the elders. He looked at the women, huddled and weeping. He looked at the remaining children. If they fought now, on the open plain, they would be slaughtered by the howitzers at the fort. "We will go," Nantan said, his voice dead. He rode to Clara's cabin one last time. It was mid-morning. The town was watching. He did not care. Clara was waiting on her porch. She had heard the news. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen. Nantan reined in his horse. He did not dismount. The soldiers were already forming up the column at the end of the street. "You are going to San Carlos," Clara said. It was not a question. "Yes," Nantan said. "They say it is a graveyard," Clara whispered. "They say nothing grows there." "We will make it grow," Nantan said, "or we will die trying." Clara walked to the fence. She reached up. Nantan reached down. Their hands clasped, pale skin against dark, fingers interlocking. "Don't go," Clara begged, her voice cracking. "Stay. Run to the mountains alone. I will bring you food. I will hide you. I cannot," Nantan said gently. "The elders, the children. Who will protect them from the soldiers? Who will hunt for them? If I leave them, I am not a man." Clara nodded, tears spilling over. She knew. It was the thing she loved most about him. His honor. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Nantan squeezed her hand. His eyes burned with a fierce, steady light. "I do not know the path," he said, "but I know the destination. I will find a way back to you. Clara, even if I have to walk through the spirit world, I will find you." "Move out!" the sergeant shouted from the column. Nantan tightened his grip one last time, then let her go. "Wait for me," he said. "I will wait," Clara promised. "Forever." Nantan turned his horse. He kicked the beast into a trot, falling in beside the line of walking figures. The old men, the weeping women, the silent warriors. Clara stood at the fence. She watched them go. She watched the column move slowly out of town, past the mocking stares of the townspeople, past the saloon where Broderick watched with a satisfied smile. She watched them move on to the open plain. The dust rose up around them, a golden haze that slowly swallowed the horses and the people. She watched until Nantan was just a speck, a dark shadow against the blinding light. She watched until the speck vanished into the heat shimmer. The silence that rushed back in to fill the space where he had been was louder than any scream. Clara gripped the rough wood of the fence, a splinter piercing her palm, but she did not feel it. She felt a tearing inside her chest, a physical rending as if her heart had been ripped out and carried away in a saddlebag. She looked at the empty horizon, the vast, brutal, beautiful land that had taken her husband and now her lover. She stood there for a long time, the sun beating down on her bonnet, refusing to turn away, refusing to let the town see her break. She was Clara Vance. She was the woman who had stood before a loaded gun. She wiped her face with her apron. She set her jaw. "I will wait," she whispered to the wind. And then, turning her back on the town that hated her, she walked into her empty cabin and closed the door. November came to the territory not with snow, but with a biting dry cold that snapped the brittle branches of the cottonwoods and froze the mud in the deep ruts of the road. The drought had not broken. It had simply hardened. The earth was like iron, ringing under the heel of a boot, and the wind carried a fine, stinging grit that found its way through every chink in the cabin walls. Bitter Creek had become a quiet place, but it was the silence of a held breath, not of peace. Clara Vance walked the half-mile to the schoolhouse each morning wrapped in a gray wool shawl that had seen better years. She kept her head down. She had learned that looking people in the eye only invited scorn, or, worse, a pitying sneer. The class had shrunk to 4 students, the poorest children in town. whose parents could not afford to keep them home for labor and did not care about the school teacher's ruined reputation. She was a pariah. The widow Vance, the woman who had thrown herself in front of a savage, the woman who had shamed the town. She survived on the few dollars the county still paid her, and on the vegetables she managed to coax from her small, dying garden. But she did not leave. To leave would be to admit they were right. To leave would be to sever the last invisible thread that connected her to the memory of Nantan. The nights were the hardest. Alone in her cabin, with the wind howling like a lost soul down the chimney, Clara would stare into the embers of her small fire. Rumors drifted into town with the freighters and the mail riders. Rumors that were whispered in the general store and shouted in the saloon. They said the Apache trail to San Carlos was marked by fresh graves. They said the government rations were rotten beef and weevily flour. They said the winter in the high passes had taken the old and the young alike. Clara would lie awake, shivering under her quilts, squeezing her eyes shut against the image of Nantan walking through the snow, his feet bleeding, his broad shoulders bowed under the weight of his people's suffering. She prayed then. She prayed to a God she felt had abandoned this corner of the world. Keep him warm. She would whisper into the dark. Keep his heart beating. Bring him back. While the town withered, Elias Broderick grew fat. He bought the O'Connell place for the price of back taxes. He bought the Miller homestead when their well ran dry and they packed up for California. His cattle ranged over half the valley now, lean and mean, guarding water holes that he fenced off with barbed wire. The town hated him, but they feared him more. He had hired a new foreman, a man named Silas Pike, who wore 2 pistols and had eyes like a dead fish. Pike brought friends, rough men who drifted in from the borderlands, men who did not work cattle so much as they patrolled Broderick's expanding kingdom. Gunshots became a common sound on the prairie. Sometimes it was just target practice. Sometimes it was a warning shot fired over the head of a traveler who strayed too close to Broderick's water. And sometimes it was a distant, dry crack that echoed off the canyon walls and was never explained. People learned to look the other way. The sheriff had retired to Tucson, and the new deputy was on Broderick's payroll. The fort was undermanned, the soldiers busy chasing phantom bands of renegades that Broderick swore were still raiding the territory. It was a Tuesday in late November when the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. Clara was at the schoolhouse late, grading the slate work of little Sarah Higgins, who had snuck back to class against her mother's wishes. The sun had set an hour ago, leaving a heavy, suffocating twilight. Clara blew out the lamp to save oil and went to the window to latch the shutter. She stopped, her hand on the wood. To the west, where the jagged silhouette of the rocky hills cut against the purple sky, there was a glow. It was not the soft orange of a sunset. It was a violent, pulsing red. Smoke. It was moving fast, driven by the relentless wind. It was not the steady column of a hearth fire or the controlled burn of a field. It was wild. Then came the sound, pop, pop, pop. It sounded like dry wood snapping in a hot fire. But Clara knew better. She had learned the sound of gunfire well enough in the last 6 months. She grabbed her shawl and ran out the door. From the elevation of the schoolhouse porch, she could see across the flatlands. The darkness was being eaten by flames. The flicker of fire was jumping from roof to roof at the farthest settlement, the Jensen farm, 3 miles out, and riding between the flames were shadows, men on horseback. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. Renegades? Had Nantan's people broken loose? No. She watched the riders move. They did not ride in the fluid, low-crouch style of the Apache. They rode heavy in the saddle, upright, spurring their horses with brutal force. These were white men. Clara ran toward the town. Her boots hammered the frozen earth. By the time she reached Main Street, the alarm had been raised. The church bell was clanging. A frantic, discordant metal shriek. People were spilling out of their houses, clutching coats and lanterns. The fear in the air was palpable, tasting of ozone and panic. "It is a raid!" "Mister," Henderson shouted, running out of his store with a shotgun. "The Apache have come back." "It is not the Apache," Clara yelled. skidding to a halt in the center of the gathering crowd. "Look at the fires! Look at how they move!" "Shut your mouth, woman!" Elias Broderick stepped off the boardwalk in front of the saloon. He looked calm, unnaturally so. "It is a war party. I warned Captain Harlow this would happen." "Where is the captain?" "Mrs." Gable cried, clutching her 2 children. "Patrol," Broderick said, shaking his head with feigned regret. "He took 20 men north yesterday. We are defenseless." A wail went up from the women. The men looked at their weapons. Old muskets, bird guns, a few rusted pistols. They looked at Broderick's hired men, who were standing by the saloon, smoking cigarettes, making no move to help. "We have to fight," Henderson shouted. "We have to barricade the street. They are flanking us," a man shouted from a rooftop. "I see riders coming up the east draw. They are circling the town." Panic, sharp and blinding, took hold. The men began to argue, shouting over one another. Some wanted to run for the fort, 5 miles away. Some wanted to hole up in the church. The women and children were pushed to the periphery, a huddle of terrified sobbing. They looked to their husbands, their fathers, but saw only confusion and cowardice. Clara watched them. She saw Mrs. Higgins weeping into her apron. She saw the children paralyzed with terror, and suddenly, a voice spoke in her mind. It was low, resonant, and calm. "The coyote does not bark when the wolf comes. The coyote vanishes." She remembered the day of the dust storm. She remembered Nantan showing her the land, not as scenery, but as shelter. He had pointed out the way the earth folded near the old creek bed, the deep ravine that cut behind the town, invisible from the main road. "The land protects those who know it," he had told her. Clara straightened her spine. The fear was still there, cold in her stomach. But overlaying it was a layer of steel she hadn't known she possessed. "Listen to me." Her voice cracked, then found its strength. She didn't shout like the men. She projected, using the teacher's tone that demanded attention. The women turned to look at her. "We cannot stay here," Clara said firmly. "If they are circling, they will burn the buildings first. The church is a trap. What do you know? Traitor?" "Mrs." Higgins spat, though her voice lacked its usual venom. "I know where to hide," Clara said. She looked at the women, meeting their eyes one by one. "I know a ravine behind the ridge. It is deep. It is shadowed. A horse cannot ride down into it. We can be there in 10 minutes if we move now." "The ravine?" "Mrs." Gable asked, trembling. "That is rattlesnake country. The snakes are sleeping for the winter." Clara said, "The outlaws are awake. Do you want to die here debating with me, or do you want to save your children?" A gunshot shattered a window in the upper floor of the hotel. The attackers were close, less than a mile out. The men were still arguing near the livery, oblivious to the women. "Come," Clara commanded. She grabbed Mrs. Gable's arm. "Bring the water skins." "You," she pointed at Mrs. Higgins, "grab the blankets. Do not run. Walk fast. Keep low. For a second." Nobody moved. Then the spell of helplessness broke. "Mrs." Gable nodded. "Mrs." Higgins wiped her face and grabbed a pile of wool blankets from a bench. "Follow me," Clara said. She led them away from the main street, slipping between the buildings into the dark alleyways. There were 20 women and 30 children. It was a clumsy, frightened herd. But Clara moved them with a relentless energy. "Keep quiet," she hissed. "Lift your feet. Do not drag them." They reached the edge of town. The open ground before the ridge was exposed. The orange glow of the burning farms cast long, dancing shadows across the scrub brush. Clara crouched low. She remembered Nantan's posture, knees bent, weight forward, eyes scanning the ground. "Step where the rock is solid." His voice whispered, "Do not break the brush." "Now," she whispered. They moved into the dark. It was a nightmare journey. The ground was treacherous, littered with sharp scree and hidden badger holes. The dust kicked up by their skirts was choking, but Clara forbade them to cough. Mrs. Miller slipped, dropping her baby. The infant began to wail. Clara was there in an instant. She scooped up the child, pressing his face into her shoulder to muffle the sound. "Hush," she whispered fiercely. "Hush now." She pulled Mrs. Miller to her feet. "You can cry later," she told the woman. "Move." They reached the lip of the ravine. It was a black gash in the earth, steep and forbidding. "Down," Clara ordered. Slowly, past the children hand to hand. She went first, sliding down the shale slope, her boots digging for purchase. She felt the ghost of Nantan's hands on her waist, guiding her, steadying her. She became the anchor at the bottom, catching children as they were lowered down into the shadows. When the last woman, Mrs. Higgins, panting and terrified, slid to the bottom, Clara pulled them all back under the overhang of the sandstone cliff. "Huddle close," Clara whispered. "Cover the children with the blankets. No talking, no moving." They crouched in the freezing darkness. The smell of sage and cold stone surrounded them. Above them, the sky turned a sickly, pulsing orange. The sounds of the attack drifted down, the smash of glass, the shouts of men, the roar of fire taking hold of dry wood. And then, the thunder of hooves. A group of riders galloped along the rim of the ravine, silhouetted against the firelight. They were close enough that Clara could hear the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. "Check the wash," a man shouted. His voice was rough, excited by violence. "Too steep," another yelled back. "They probably ran for the fort. Let's circle back and check the saloon," Broderick said. "Leave no witnesses this time." Broderick. The name drifted down to the women hiding in the dark. "Mrs." Higgins gasped. "Mrs." Gable gripped Clara's arm so hard her nails drew blood. The riders thundered away, back toward the town. In the silence that followed, the women looked at Clara. They saw the widow they had shunned, the woman they had called a traitor. Her face was smudged with soot. Her bonnet was gone, her hair wild in the wind. She held Mrs. Miller's baby against her chest, her eyes fixed on the rim above, fierce and unblinking. She had not saved them with prayer. She had saved them with the skills of the Apache. "Thank you, Mrs." Gable whispered, her voice shaking. Clara did not look at her. She watched the rim. "We are not safe yet," she said quietly. "We wait, 70 miles to the east, in the desolate foothills of the Dragoon Mountains." The wind was just as cold. Nantan sat on his horse, looking down at a map spread across a flat rock. He wore a heavy blue wool coat over his buckskins, the uniform of an army scout. It fit him poorly, tight across the shoulders, but it kept the frostbite at bay. Beside him sat Major Trent. The Major was a different breed of man than Captain Harlow. He was older, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much war to be eager for it. He chewed on an unlit cigar, studying the map. "You are sure?" "Scout?" Trent asked. "I am sure," Nantan said. He pointed to the map. "The pattern is a circle. The raid started here, at the North Grays, then the east. Now reports say smoke at the south. Broderick herds the people like cattle." "He squeezes them out." Trent sighed. He rubbed his face. "Broderick has friends in Washington. If I move against him without proof, I lose my commission." "If you do not move," Nantan said, his voice hard as flint, "people die." He looked at the Major. He did not plead, he did not beg. He spoke as a warrior to a warrior. "I know this wolf," Nantan said. "He eats everything. He does not stop until the belly bursts. He has emptied the farms, now he will eat the town." Trent looked up. "The town? Bitter Creek?" Nantan nodded. The image of Clara filled his mind. Her smile, her courage, the way she had stood at the fence as he rode away. The thought of Broderick's hired killers riding into that town, where she slept alone in her cabin, was a physical agony in his gut. "There are women there," Nantan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "Children, innocents. You wear the coat of a protector. Major, protect them." Trent looked at the scout. He saw the terrifying intensity in the Apache's eyes. He saw a man who was holding back a tidal wave of violence by a thread of discipline. "How far?" Trent asked. "We can make it by dawn," Nantan said. "If we ride hard." Trent spat the cigar out. He turned to his sergeant. "Sound boots and saddles." "Sergeant, we ride for Bitter Creek. No wagons. Carbines and ammunition only." Double time, the camp erupted into activity. Nantan did not wait for the formation. He swung his horse around, checking the cinch. His roan was gaunt, ribs showing through the winter coat, but it had heart. Nantan leaned forward, whispering into the horse's ear. "One more time, brother, one more run." He mounted. He looked west, toward the invisible horizon where Clara waited. "Hold on. Clara," he whispered to the wind. The column moved out, but Nantan was at the lead. He did not set a trot. He set a gallop. The major shouted something about pacing the horses, but Nantan did not listen. He kicked his heels, and the roan surged forward into the black, freezing night. He rode not for the army, and not for the law. He rode for the woman who had watched him leave. He rode with the desperation of a man who knew that if he arrived 1 minute too late, the light of his life would be extinguished forever. The night in the ravine was an eternity. The fire in the town burned itself out, leaving only a sullen red glow against the low clouds. The gunshots became sporadic, then ceased. The shouts of the outlaws faded as they likely retreated to the saloon to celebrate their victory or rode out to check the perimeter. Clara did not let the women move. They huddled together for warmth, a tangled mass of skirts and shawls. Clara sat at the entrance of the overhang, watching the sky change. She felt hollowed out. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a shivering exhaustion. She thought of her cabin. It was likely ash now. Her books, her few dresses, the letters from William, all gone. She touched the ring at her neck. It was still there, and the memory of Nantan was still there. "I will find a way back to you." She looked at the stars fading in the east. The gray light of pre-dawn was creeping over the horizon. It was the coldest hour of the night. "We have to move," Clara whispered to the group. "We have to see if the soldiers have returned. We need water, slowly, stiffly." The women stood up. They brushed the dirt from their clothes. They looked at Clara with new eyes. There was no judgment in their faces now, only dependency. "Lead us, Mrs." Gable said. Clara nodded. She turned and began the climb back up the slope. It was harder going up. Her boots slipped. Her hands were raw and bleeding from the sharp rocks. They crested the rim just as the sun broke the horizon, a pale, watery yellow light that offered no warmth. The view that greeted them was a punch to the gut. Bitter Creek was a smoking ruin. The general store was a charred skeleton. The church steeple had collapsed. Half the houses were gone, reduced to black squares of ash on the hard ground. Bodies lay scattered in the street. Clara felt the women behind her gasp and recoil. "Stay here," Clara ordered. "Keep the children back." She walked forward alone. She had to know. She had to see if... She walked toward the main street. The silence was absolute. No dogs barked. No roosters crowed. She passed a body lying face down near the trough. It was Mr. Henderson. His shotgun lay just out of reach of his hand. She kept walking. Her eyes scanned the wreckage of her cabin. The roof had fallen in. The walls were black stumps. She felt a sob rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She could not break. Not now. Then she heard it, a sound, faint and rhythmic, coming from the east. It was a vibration in the ground before it was a noise. Thunder? No, the sky was clear. Hooves, many hooves. Clara froze. She looked toward the eastern rise. Were the outlaws coming back to finish the job? She looked around for a weapon. There was nothing but rocks and ash. She stood in the middle of the street, defenseless, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. If it was Broderick's men, she would not run. She would stand. She would testify with her dying breath. The dust cloud appeared first, rising gold and backlit by the sun. Then the dark shapes of riders crested the hill. They were moving fast, a dark wave pouring down the slope. Clara squinted against the glare. She saw blue coats, soldiers. Relief, sharp and dizzying, washed over her. But she did not move. She waited. And then she saw him, riding at the front, far ahead of the column. was a rider who did not sit like a soldier. He rode hunched forward, urging his horse with a desperate intensity. He wore a blue coat, but his hair flew long and black in the wind. Nantan. Clara's knees gave way. She stumbled, catching herself before she fell. He was there. He was real. He was racing toward her across the broken ground as if the hounds of hell were snapping at his heels. She watched him pull away from the soldiers, his horse foaming, his face set in a grimace of pure, terrifying determination. He saw her, even at this distance. She saw the change in him. He sat up. He raised a hand. Clara let out a cry that was half laugh, half sob. She picked up her skirts and began to run toward him, stumbling over the debris of her life, running toward the only thing that remained. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge, casting long, bruised shadows across the smoking ruins of Bitter Creek, when the world exploded into chaos for the second time. Clara Vance was running toward the oncoming riders, her heart surging with a desperate hope. When she saw the muzzle flashes from the tree line near the dry creek bed, the outlaws, the men Broderick had paid to burn the town, had not fled. They had merely pulled back to regroup. And now, seeing the army column approaching, they realized they were trapped, like cornered wolves. They turned to fight. "Get down!" Nantan's voice roared over the thunder of hooves. He did not slow his horse, while the soldiers behind him fanned out into a skirmish line. Nantan drove his gaunt roan straight toward the source of the gunfire. He was a blur of motion, swinging his body low behind the horse's neck, presenting no target to the shooters. Clara threw herself to the ground behind the stone trough of the blackened blacksmith shop. The air above her head snapped and hissed with the passage of lead. The silence of the morning was shattered by the scream of horses and the flat, cracking report of carbines. From her vantage point, pressed into the cold dust, Clara watched the battle unfold with a terrifying clarity. Major Trent shouted orders, his voice calm amidst the noise. "Dismount! Skirmish line! Pour it on! Boys!" The soldiers hit the ground, kneeling and firing with disciplined rhythm. But it was Nantan and the 4 Apache scouts riding with him who turned the tide. They did not fight like the soldiers, standing in lines. They flowed like water. They slipped from their horses and vanished into the brush, flanking the outlaws' position. Clara saw Nantan rise from behind a fallen log, his rifle snapping to his shoulder. He fired once, worked the lever, and fired again. A man in the tree line threw up his arms and fell backward. It was not the fighting of a savage, as the townspeople had always claimed. It was the fighting of a man who knew the cost of every bullet. Nantan moved with a grim, terrible efficiency. He was not killing for glory. He was killing to stop the burning. He was killing to clear the path to her. The outlaws, realizing they were being flanked by men who knew the land better than they did, broke cover. They ran for their horses, trying to scramble up the scree slope toward the high mesa. "Hold fire!" Major Trent shouted. Nantan did not hold fire. He saw the leader of the outlaws, a man wearing a distinct yellow duster coat, trying to mount a panicked horse. Nantan took careful aim. He fired. The horse reared, and the man fell, pinned beneath the animal. The remaining outlaws threw down their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. The dust began to settle, drifting in lazy clouds across the sun. Clara stood up. Her legs were shaking so violently she had to hold on to the trough. She scanned the field, looking for the tall silhouette, the long black hair. She saw him. He was walking toward the pinned outlaw leader, but his step was wrong. He was listing to the left. "Nantan!" she screamed. He turned toward her voice. Across the 50 yards of broken ground, their eyes met. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The smoke, the soldiers, the ruined buildings, it all fell away. There was only him. He looked exhausted, his face streaked with sweat and war paint, his blue army coat torn, but his eyes were alive. They burned with a relief so profound it hit Clara like a physical blow. He took a step toward her. Then he stumbled. Clara saw the dark stain spreading on the side of his buckskin shirt, just below the ribs, soaking through the blue wool of the coat. "No," she gasped. She ran. She flew over the debris, ignoring the shouts of the soldiers who were securing the prisoners. She reached Nantan just as his knees gave way. She caught him. She was half his size, but panic gave her strength. She eased him down onto the hard earth, her hands immediately pressing against the wound. "Clara!" he rasped. His voice was wet. "Hush!" Clara commanded, tears blinding her. "Do not speak. You are fine. It is just a scratch." She pulled his coat open. The bullet had grazed his side, tearing a deep furrow through muscle and grazing the rib, but it had not pierced the lung. The blood was bright red and flowing fast, but he was breathing. "You foolish, foolish man," she sobbed, pressing her apron against the wound to staunch the flow. "You came back. I promised," Nantan whispered. He reached up with a bloody hand and touched her cheek. "I promised I would find you." Clara covered his hand with hers, pressing it to her face. She did not care who was watching. She did not care that Major Trent was walking toward them, or that the women she had led to the ravine were now emerging from the alleyways, staring in shock. "Do not leave me again," Clara begged, her voice raw and carrying in the sudden silence of the battlefield. "I cannot do this alone. I cannot live in this world without you." Nantan looked up at her, his eyes dark with pain and adoration. "You are my world. Clara." A ripple of murmurs went through the gathering crowd. They saw the widow, the school teacher, kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in the blood of an Apache scout, her face twisted with a love so fierce it shamed them. They saw the way he looked at her, not as a conqueror, but as a man finding his home. Major Trent arrived, his boots crunching on the gravel. He looked down at Nantan, then at Clara. He took off his hat. "Is he going to make it, ma'am?" Trent asked gently. "He has to," Clara said fiercely. She looked up at the officer. "He saved us. He saved all of us." Trent nodded. He turned to the medic who was running up with a bag. "See to the scout? He is a hero of the Republic today." The medic knelt, replacing Clara's hands with bandages. Clara did not move away. She sat in the dirt, holding Nantan's hand, anchoring him to the earth, over by the tree line. 2 soldiers were dragging the outlaw leader, the man in the yellow duster, toward the road. It was Silas Pike, Broderick's foreman. Major Trent walked over to the prisoner. He looked at the saddlebags on Pike's horse, which another soldier had just opened. "Well now," Trent said, his voice hard. "Look at this. Spencer carbines, Army issue, stolen from the supply train 3 months back. And look here, a brand iron." Trent held up the iron. It was a running iron, used to alter brands. Pike spat blood on the ground. "I was just following orders." "Whose orders?" Trent asked. Pike looked toward the town. He looked toward the hotel, where Elias Broderick was standing on the balcony, watching the scene with a face the color of ash. Pike laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Ask the man in the suit. He paid $500 for the fires. He said if we burned them out, the army would chase the Indians and leave the land for him." Major Trent turned slowly toward the hotel. He signaled to his sergeant, "Bring him down here." Broderick did not wait to be brought. He saw the game was up. He saw the soldiers looking up at him with disgust. He saw the townspeople, the very people he had manipulated, staring at him with dawning realization. He turned to run back into the hotel room, perhaps to grab the shotgun he kept behind the door or to flee out the back stairs. Major Trent raised his revolver. "Halt!" Broderick panicked. He reappeared at the railing, a pistol in his hand. He raised it, aiming blindly at the soldiers below. A single shot rang out. It was not Major Trent. It was Nantan. From his position on the ground, while the medic worked on his side, Nantan had pulled his heavy Colt revolver from its holster. His hand was shaking, but his aim was true. The bullet struck the railing in front of Broderick, sending a shower of splinters into his face. Broderick screamed, dropping his gun and clutching his eyes. Soldiers stormed the hotel stairs. Minutes later, they dragged Elias Broderick out into the street. He was weeping, a small, broken man stripped of his power. Trent holstered his gun. "Arrest him, transport him to the territorial prison, and Pike too." The townspeople stood in silence. They looked at Broderick, the man they had feared and obeyed. Then they looked at Nantan, the man they had hated. The truth was a bitter pill. They had burned with hatred for a phantom while the devil walked among them in a fine suit. Mrs. Gable stepped forward. She walked past Broderick without looking at him. She walked to where Clara sat in the dust. She held out a canteen of water. "For him, Mrs." Gable said quietly. Clara looked up. She saw shame in the woman's eyes, but she also saw respect. She took the canteen. "Thank you," Clara said. Change did not come like a flood. It came like the slow thawing of winter ice. But it had begun. The recovery was slow. Clara's cabin was gone. So they set up a temporary shelter in the back room of the livery stable, which had survived the fire. It smelled of hay and horses, but it was warm. For 2 weeks. Clara did not leave Nantan's side. She changed his bandages, washing the wound with boiled water and clean rags. She fed him broth made from the few chickens that had survived the raid. Nantan was a terrible patient. He hated being still. He hated the weakness that kept him on the cot. "I should be up," he grumbled one evening. "Trying to sit. The snow will come soon." "I need to check the horses. You need to heal," Clara said, pushing him back down firmly. "The horses are fine. The major has assigned a trooper to watch them." Nantan lay back, sighing. He watched her as she moved around the small room in the lantern light. His eyes followed her hands, her hips, the sway of her skirt. "You are tired." "Clara," he said softly, "your eyes are dark." "I am fine," Clara said, though she was exhausted. "Come here," Nantan said. Clara walked to the cot. Nantan moved over, wincing slightly, making room for her on the narrow mattress. "Sit." Clara sat. Nantan took her hand and pulled her down until she was lying beside him, her head on his uninjured shoulder. "Rest," he commanded. Clara closed her eyes. The steady beat of his heart against her ear was the only lullaby she needed. She felt his arm come around her, holding her close. They lay there in the quiet dark, 2 survivors of a storm that had nearly destroyed them both. Outside, the town was rebuilding. Hammers rang against wood during the day. People were talking. The women came by sometimes. They brought food, a loaf of bread, a jar of preserved peaches. They did not stay long, and they did not say much. But the venom was gone from their voices. They had seen Clara lead them through the dark. They had seen Nantan bleed for them. It was hard to hold on to old hatreds when the evidence of their salvation was sleeping in the livery stable. But not everyone changed. Some men still spat when they walked past the stable. Some muttered that it was unnatural. A white woman laying with an Indian, hero or not. Nantan heard them. He said nothing, but his eyes grew hard. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the battle, Nantan was well enough to walk. He asked Clara to walk with him. They walked out of town, past the burnt ruins of the outer farms, up to a high bluff that overlooked the valley. The wind was cold, stripping the heat from the weak December sun. Nantan stood looking at the horizon, his black hair whipping across his face. "I must go soon," he said. Clara froze. The fear that had been dormant in her chest uncoiled like a snake. "Go? Where? The major said you could stay until spring." Nantan shook his head. "The major is a good man, but he is army. Orders will come from Washington. They will say all Apache must go to the reservation. If I stay here, if I stay with you, the hate will come back." He turned to her. "I see how they look at you. Clara, the men at the saloon, they whisper. They say you are his woman. They say ugly things. Let them say it," Clara cried. "I am his woman. I am your woman." "It is dangerous," Nantan said. "A mixed house. The law does not like it. The church does not like it. If I stay, I put a target on your back. I should go to the mountains. I should disappear. You can rebuild your school. You can be respected again." Clara stepped forward. She grabbed the lapels of his heavy coat and shook him, or tried to. "Respected?" She laughed, a sharp, angry sound. "Do you think I care about their respect? After everything?" She looked into his eyes, her own blazing with a fierce, stubborn light. "I lived for their respect for 2 years. Nantan, I died inside every day. I was lonely and I was afraid and I was nothing. Then you walked into that store." She softened her grip, her hand sliding up to cup his face. "You woke me up. You showed me that I am strong. You showed me what honor looks like. You are my home. Nantan. Not that town. Not a building. You. Nantan stared at her. He saw the truth in her face. He saw that she was not a fragile thing to be protected, but a woman who had walked through fire and come out steel. He closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. I have nothing to give you, he whispered. I have no land. I have no money. I have only this broken life. It is not broken, Clara said. It is ours. She pulled his head down. He kissed her. It was not the desperate kiss of the night in the cabin, nor the terrified kiss of the battlefield. It was a kiss of arrival. It was slow and deep, a sealing of a covenant. Nantan's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. His fingers moved into her hair, holding her head steady as he poured every ounce of his gratitude and his love into the pressure of his mouth on hers. Clara felt the cold wind vanish. She felt only the heat of him, the strength of his body against hers, the promise that vibrated between them. When they broke apart, breathless, Nantan rested his forehead against hers. We cannot live in the town, he said. No, Clara agreed. And we cannot live on the reservation. No. Nantan looked out at the valley. There was a small canyon, 5 miles to the north. It had a spring that the drought had not killed. It was rocky and hard, but it was hidden. There is a place, he said, Hidden Valley. The soil is full of stones. The wind is cruel, but it is free. Take me there, Clara said. They moved in January. It was not a grand migration. It was a man and a woman, a gaunt roan horse, and a mule laden with supplies that Clara had purchased with her last army wages. They built a small cabin from the stones of the canyon and the timber of the cottonwoods. It was hard, back-breaking work. Nantan cut the logs, his axe ringing in the cold air. Clara mixed the mud for the chinking, her hands red and raw from the freezing water. They worked side by side. They did not speak much. They did not need to. They moved with the rhythm of a partnership that had been forged in survival. Spring came late, but it came. The drought finally broke with a thunderstorm that shook the mountains and flooded the dry washes. Green grass pushed up through the rocky soil. One afternoon in late April, the sun was blazing down on their small homestead. Nantan was setting fence posts along the ridge, marking the line of their garden. He was shirtless, his skin dark bronze in the sun, the scar on his side a white puckered line. Clara was planting corn in the rows he had tilled. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She wore a simple cotton dress, faded and practical. She stood up to stretch her back. She looked at Nantan. He paused in his work. He leaned on the post-hole digger and looked at her. He did not smile often, but he smiled now. It was a small, private thing, just a quirk of the lips and a softening of the eyes. He walked over to the water bucket. He took a ladleful and drank, then offered it to her. Clara took it. Their fingers brushed. The spark was still there, the electric jolt that had started in a supply room and survived a war. Hard ground, Nantan said, looking at the garden. Good roots, Clara replied. They stood there for a moment, watching a hawk circle high above in the blue sky. In the distance, miles away, the smoke of Bitter Creek rose into the air. The town was rebuilding. People were living their lives, bound by their rules and their fears. It sat like a stubborn scar on the plain. But here, in the canyon, the world felt new. As evening fell, they sat on the wooden bench Nantan had built in front of the cabin. The fire in the pit cracked softly, sending sparks up to join the first stars. The mountains to the west were purple and jagged, beautiful and dangerous. The future was uncertain. The army might come back. The prejudices of the world might come knocking at their door. The land might turn dry again. Clara reached out and took Nantan's hand. He interlaced his fingers with hers, his grip warm and solid. She rested her head on his shoulder. He leaned his cheek against her hair. They watched the night settle over the vast, unforgiving west. They were 2 small specks in an immense wilderness, but the love that held them together was a quiet, fierce light that pushed back the dark. It was a defiance, It was a victory, and as the coyotes began to sing to the rising moon, Clara knew that no matter what came tomorrow, tonight they were real, and they were home. Closing message. Thank you for journeying with me through this story of Clara and Nantan. It has been a privilege to bring the dusty streets of Bitter Creek and the enduring spirit of the American West to life for you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story. Did Clara's choice resonate with you? If you enjoyed this tale of forbidden love and survival, please subscribe to the channel From Wild West. We have many more stories to tell from the frontier, and we would be honored to have you ride with us. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.